Hello everybody, welcome to this Gallery Teachers Masterclass. My name is Neil Harris and today we're going to be talking about checking student understanding. And I've chosen that topic because in my experience, both as a teacher and as a teacher trainer working with teachers all over the world, very often this is an area that is perhaps either not fully understood or in some cases really not paid attention to at all. And even for teachers who have been trained in the use of ICQs, instruction checking questions, and CCQs, concept checking questions, and other ways of checking student understanding, quite often it just seems to be one of those areas that people find difficult. So what I'm hoping to do today in this presentation is to provide you with some ways that will help you to understand how to make this simpler for you, and in so doing, to make the whole process of learning easier for your students. If we look quickly at the topics of the presentation, what we're going to start looking at is instruction checking questions. We'll then moving on to concept checking questions, so from ICQs to CCQs, and you will see a lot of similarities between them. And then we'll end with other ways of checking understanding. To begin, I wanted you to think about how you perceive yourself as a teacher, and you'll see on screen a large number of metaphors to describe the role or roles that you as teachers may take at different points in your lessons, and possibly with different students. So as these appear on screen, what I'd like you to do is consider which of these most closely relate to how you see yourself as a teacher of English as a foreign or second language. You might wonder why I've started with this. Well, as a reflection point for all of us, what's coming up on screen now, my reflection question, will explain why I think this is important. Because I do believe that there is a relationship, sometimes clear, sometimes less so, between the role or roles that we assume as teachers and the way in which we support our students' learnings. And therefore, I think the more facilitative, the more supportive we see our role as the teacher, the more likely it is that we will want to make sure that our students understand what is going on, but perhaps more importantly, that we will take active responsibility for ensuring that understanding. So let's start with something that you mustn't do. And let me ask you this question. Do you understand? Well, I think we're all guilty of smiling at our students. We're all looking at us and smiling and giving every sign of understanding. And we ask the question, does everyone understand? And then one student volunteers, yes. And we think, okay, let's move on. But this is fraught with danger. Because students who are nice or who are just embarrassed, particularly if nominated, will say yes when in fact they don't understand at all. Another problem is the student who says yes and they really do think that they do understand, but actually they haven't. They have, to use the idiom, got to the wrong end of the stick. They've misunderstood what we've said but not realised this. You then have the student who says yes and does understand, but this actually tells us very little about the other students in the room. And so as a question, it is, I believe, very much redundant. And also, how can students be sure? Because when we ask, do you understand? And they say yes, there is no cross-check that they actually have understood. And this is where ICQs come in and why the question, do you understand, or is everything clear, has no part in the language classroom, in my view. Going to bring up on screen now quite a long passage that comes from Jeremy Harmer's very frequently cited book for teachers who are newly qualifying. That is The Practice of English Language Teaching. And I don't expect you to read all of it, but what I have done for you on the next slide is highlighted what I think are the key points that he wants to make. They appear in yellow. And then at the top, his tips for things to avoid. Now, if I summarize these points for you as bullet points, they'll become much clearer, and that's coming up now. So, according to Harmer, for success, we need, first of all, to get the whole class to be attentive. And the things that we should be thinking of in terms of checking that they have understood our instructions are what the students need to know, the order in which they need to know it, and also to think about what is the most efficient way of delivering that instruction. In essence, short, clear statements with pauses after each one are much better than speaking very quickly and at totally natural speed. Because even if you have high-level students, perhaps preparing for a C1 or a C2 level class, where you want to give them lots of exposure to natural language, nevertheless, when it comes to instructions, it makes sense to continue to speak at normal speed, but to include those longer pauses between sense units, much as I've just demonstrated just now. This gives the students time to absorb. I think it's also useful to repeat the statement, deliver the instructions, and then restate it perhaps in full afterwards. But also, as Harmer has identified here, and the bold is my own annotation, when you've delivered your instructions, you should ask check questions to ensure that they've understood. Other strategies would include asking a student to explain the instructions to their classmates in L1. You can demonstrate an activity. That's a wonderful way of working. And also, as the teacher, if you think that your instructions are often misunderstood, why not try rehearsing your instructions before going to class? And if I've got a particularly difficult set of instructions, this is something I will often do, perhaps with my colleagues in the staff room. More difficult, I know, if you're working remotely and you don't have a close member of staff to hand where you're preparing your lessons from. But, you know, WhatsApp can enable this, and WhatsApp voice. So let's think about ICQs, the good and the bad. Again, quite a busy screen, but allow me to demonstrate the difference between the two as I read the instructions aloud for you. And I'll begin with teacher one. Open your books and look at the pictures about what the man does now and what he used to do. Okay, yeah, they're on page 87. You can find them in just a sec. Doesn't really matter now. Okay, so these are some ideas for you to be thinking about. Okay, and then what I want you to do is you're going to write some sentences, about 4 or maybe a few more. If you don't find time, don't worry. Let's compare that with the second teacher who is delivering the same instructions. Look at these pictures. Holds up the book to page 87 and points to the pictures. You can use these for ideas if you want. Then write some sentences about things you used to do, but you don't do now. Write 4 sentences, please. What are the sentences about? How can you use the pictures? How many sentences? We can see a clear difference in the quality of the delivery of those instructions. The first one, there was just too much language. There was even a degree of uncertainty from the teacher about what he really or she really wanted the students to do. Whereas If we think about the second set of instructions, and I've highlighted on screen for you here the key checking questions, the teacher actively asks the students in a talkback mechanism to tell him or her, what are you going to do? How are you going to do it? And this, I think, is an extremely helpful way of making sure that your students understand what you want them to do at the point of giving instructions. So let's try to create then a checklist of what we should do with these so-called ICQs, the information checking questions. Well, they should be delivered at the point where they are needed. Notice in the previous page that the first stage of the instructions are delivered. The students write their sentences, and only then does the teacher instruct the second stage, the mingling activity, during which the students compare what they've written. Whereas in the first set of instructions, it's all delivered at the same time, meaning that students may actually forget what they have to do in a later stage of the cycle of the task. Likewise, they're broken down into individual points, by which I mean, what are you going to do? How many sentences are you going to write? What are they about? So they look at the core instruction and they deliver them point by point. They check them point by point. Likewise, by using the book and holding it up and pointing to the pictures, this is a reinforcement that the students are looking at pictures on page 87. The ICQs don't endlessly repeat the language of instruction, but they use different language to probe understanding, by which I mean, with the ICQs, you paraphrase what it is that you're wanting to check. So that if students haven't understood your language first time round, by going through the ICQs, not only do you check understanding with those who got it first time, but you provide your learners who didn't understand you first time with an alternative way of understanding, which may enable them to understand first time via the check. The language of the ICQs is graded. It's lower than the language potentially, or the certainly lower than the level of the language that will be practiced during the activity. And we avoid complex language, complex Lexis, therefore, and complex grammar. And indeed, there is an argument that we can almost move into baby talk by removing articles and even in compound tenses, some of the auxiliaries. There is an argument we should make redundant language like what I want you to do now is. Now, I think as the level goes up, you can give rich exposure to your students, even in your instructions, but remember to pause. But nevertheless, in the instruction stage, the key thing is the students need to know what you're doing. It's not a model of target language. And finally, as I've said before, deliver at natural pace, natural speed, but chunk the language. Put pauses in so students have that unnecessary processing time. Okay, so here is a question for you to think about and as a stimulus for discussion in the question and answer session at the end. To what extent is the use of ICQs level dependent? Those of you who work with students at, say, C1 or C2 level, Cambridge Advanced and Proficiency, are ICQs necessary with them? And secondly, is it useful to write them in advance? Or also, should they be used strategically based on cues from your students? By which I mean, are you going to use ICQs with a group of students that you know well, when knowing them well, you've got body language cues that the majority of the course of the class have understood? There, I think, is the clue, for me at least. The majority may have understood, but are we looking for majority understanding of our instructions, or are we looking for 100% understanding of our instructions? Okay, so let's move on and now look at CCQs, concept checking questions. And here we have a picture of a student. Can we really read this student's body language? For me, they look quite relaxed, quite happy, but I'm not 100% certain that this student is fully clear about what's happening. Let me paint a picture for you, particularly for those of you who teach students from Romance language backgrounds. So here I'm thinking of languages like French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and so on. So this particular student is trying to grasp the past simple and the present perfect, but has the problem that the form of the past simple in his L1 resembles the form of the present perfect in English. And this is causing him all sorts of confusion. So, question: should the teacher, if they have access to L1, use an explanation in the student's mother tongue to explain the difference? Well, of course, this is an option that is only available to teachers who share that L1. If you're watching this webinar, this masterclass, from a country where English is the first language, you may well have students from 3, 4, 5 multiple L1s. And clearly we can't prejudice against students whose L1 we don't speak if we happen to speak the L1 of one of the students in the class. And this is a clear rationale for the use of CCQs. Where we don't share an L1 with those students, we don't even have the option of explanation in L1. But I do think it has its merits. So if we think about a rationale for the use of CCQs, concept checking questions, what I wanted to do was begin by thinking about the value of teacher explanation. It can be very quick, particularly if working with vocabulary. What does that mean? Translation. Student gets it, as long as, of course, it's the right translation. It can be done in L1, if that's available to everyone involved, or in L2. And it may well be informed for those of you whose first language isn't English by some of the experience that you had learning English yourself. You know, that, well, I remember when I was learning English that I often found it confusing that the past simple looks like the present perfect when it's translated into French or whatever language it is that is your L1. However, in doing that, the risk is that it becomes very teacher-centered, that the students look to you for the explanation and almost switch off. They become passive receivers. And if they're passive receivers, you don't really know whether they've got the point that you're making. Likewise, TTT goes up. And I think at this point, therefore, that the use of CCQs comes into its own. Because, like a teacher explanation, it can be quick. In fact, it is always quick. It's punchy. It gets to the point. It's delivered in the target language. It's learner-centered. It reduces teacher talk time. But for me, most importantly, the students are involved in that understanding of whatever it is that you're checking, be it vocabulary or grammar. And like we've seen with ICQs, if you didn't get it first time in the teacher presentation, you have an opportunity to get it second time round. However, these do come with a warning. It's not always easy to think of these CCQs spontaneously in the classroom, arguing therefore for the potential writing of them at the lesson plan stage. And one thing I would add here is very often if you're using teachers' books for commercially available course books, the CCQs very often are not in there. So it's on you as the teacher to think of your own. So have a look at the picture that's on screen now and ask yourself the question, what can you see? What one-word adjective do you think I'm trying to get at here? And in particular, I want you to be focusing on the man who's lying down with an empty battery. Okay, so in terms of checking new meaning, there are a number of things that we can do. And these are taken from Tricia Hedges' wonderful book, often used at diploma level, called Teaching, Learn and Learning in the Language Classroom. It's published by Oxford back in 2000. Now, she talks about mime and gesture. That's problematic as a gesture. A verbal explanation. I had a really long day. I got up at 5 o'clock. I worked until midnight. I put in a 13-hour day. That included having to pick up lots of rocks and move them, and it made me feel really, ugh. There's another gesture for you. Ugh. You could use a synonym or an antonym in L1 or L2. Translation obviously is an option. Realia, if available. I wouldn't suggest bringing in a supine man into your classroom to demonstrate the meaning of this word. Pictures and dictionary use. Now, all of these are good, but let me ask you now what you think the word is. Now, a number of you may well have come up with the word tired, and well done if you did. Maybe helped you, or maybe that confused you and you thought of the word asleep. And here is the issue, and this is how CCQs are so useful. With CCQs, we can get right to the heart of the matter very, very quickly. Do I have a lot or no energy? Very little, none. When you feel like this, do you want to go to the gym or go to sleep? Sleep. So the word's clearly not asleep. Is it more or less than tired? More. So already we've got a really big clue here that we're looking for something that's more than tired, that may not have been sufficiently made clear by mime gesture. And the word we're looking for, therefore, is exhausted. So as a quick checklist of how CCQs can work with vocabulary, I'll just bring them up on screen one by one so you have a chance to have a look at them. My point here is that with your CCQs, you should be, as the teacher, thinking about the following. Can they be answered with short yes, no, or 1 or 2 word answers? And if they can't, rewrite them. Are the questions themselves easy to answer? They should be, whatever the level of the language you're teaching. Do they probe core meaning? By which I mean exhausted has at its core the fact that it is more than tired. And a great way of checking core meaning for vocabulary is to use a good learner dictionary, a point that I make in the 3rd bullet point on the right-hand side. Aim for 3 or 4 CCQs. These are often just the right number in order to get to the core without making it too difficult for the learner. Yes, you can reinforce them by gesture and mime. And importantly, think about when you're going to deliver them. They should be delivered in a traditional PPP lesson after you've presented the language, but before the students start using it for themselves. So between or as part of the presentation stage, when you're handing over to the students, but before they actually start working, maybe with a gap fill or whatever it is you want to do in controlled practice. It's not required for all Lexis. Don't suddenly think that you need to CCQ every new bit of language. Focus on the target language if it's a vocabulary lesson that you're working on. Ideally, with new language, you're probably working with a small set of maybe 7 or so new items. If you're doing 20, the students will have overload. They won't remember them all. And perhaps if you've got a couple of words that are blocking understanding, if it's a reading skills or definitely a listening skills lesson, you just want to make sure that the students understand this language so it doesn't inhibit their ability to practice their listening or their reading. That's another good time where you could use CCQs. I wouldn't necessarily do it for pre-taught Lexis before a reading. If it's a matching exercise and it's just enough to make sure that the students don't get blocked, that pre-taught phase is probably enough. Whereas in a listening where the students don't have the contextual clues in exactly the same way as they do in a reading, perhaps it's more useful. Okay, so that's vocabulary. Let's have a think about CCQs and grammar. Right, so I wanted to come up with a sentence that would make sense for the context of this gallery teacher masterclass. And the one I came up with is this one. By the end of this session, I, meaning you, the attendees, will have been reviewing the skill of checking understanding for over an hour. 30-35 minutes in this presentation, and then the rest of the time, that very valuable Q&A that you're going to enjoy in the live session. Okay, so what we have to do in order to work with the understanding of the grammar that we'll have been reviewing, for any bit of grammar that you want to check with concept checking questions, you need to think, well, what is the form? What is its core meaning, and where can I find that out? A particular problem for newly qualified teachers, and then create our 3 CCQs. And here are my answers to those 3 points. So number 1, the form is the future perfect continuous. It's subject plus will plus have plus verb ing. How can I check core meaning? Well, I think with this one, and I'm going to come through to the next slide, a number of ways you can do this is talk to your colleagues, people who have maybe a bit more experience than you. Look in the teacher's book. Does that help you? You can search online, and you can use, of course, reference material. And in terms of reference material, I'm putting up now 3 titles which I think are particularly good at analysing core meaning, making it clear for teachers, and also in some cases providing examples of CCQs for you. And certainly people that I've trained as a teacher trainer really rave about Scrivener's Teaching English Grammar. It is very clear, it gives you nice context, and it gives you some CCQs which you can adapt for the context of the language that you have as your target item from your course book. In terms of producing the 3 CCQs, what I thought was, what are the salient points, the core points of meaning in I will have been reviewing? If I can just give you a few moments just to maybe jot down on a piece of paper, if you have one handy, or if not, in your head, just think about what 3 points do you need to get across if you were teaching this verb form. So as I thought about this, I decided that the key points here are I would need to identify what it is, a future perfect continuous. I'd need to identify the form, will have been, plus verb ing. But for my CCQ, what I would need to do is look at these points here. What time is it situated in? Is there an end point or no end point? And what am I focusing on here? Is it will have been ing or is it reviewing? And then I create my CCQs accordingly. So it looks at future time. It has an end point, and our focus is on the meaning of will have been. It's generalizable. Every instance of this meaning of the future perfect continuous should be contained in our CCQ, not checking what review means. And I've got some CCQs that I'd like you to have a look on screen and decide what you think about them. What's the temporal focus of the activity? And there's the answer. What will I have been doing by the end of the session? Reviewing the checking of understanding. What is the duration? Over an hour. Good or bad? Have a look at the next set. When did it start? Past. When does it finish? Future. What is the end point? The end of this session. Is the durational process important? Yes. The second set of CCQs really focus without using difficult language, temporal focus, without restating the target form, will have been, and don't get tied up in what tense to use in the question. The focus is, you could always say, when? Past, present, future? When finish? Future. So again, notice how we can, even at high levels, remove some of those auxiliary verbs, for example. So, as a checklist then, and you'll see the similarity between this and the ICQ checklist. Everything that's come up so far is exactly the same as we saw for ICQs. We can add grading language, I think was there as well. Nevertheless, same time when we use them, but we may want to script them in advance. They don't focus on the meaning of the Lexis. They focus on the meaning of the structure. Forget review, focus on will, have, been, verb, ing. And again, if you're not sure where to go to, have a look at Scrivener and Workman, and more about Graham Workman's book in a moment. Now, in the final stage, the shortest stage of this presentation, I promised that we would look at other ways of checking meaning. And of course, we've looked at some already. There's Tricia Hedges' taxonomy, her list of ways of checking meaning, gave us, besides CCQs, a whole list of opportunities. However, one that I think is particularly useful for verb grammar, so very useful for those of you working with general English and IELTS preparation particularly, is Graham Workman's book, Concept Questions and Timelines. It is unfortunately out of print. You may be able to find copies online. And what's so great about it is, as the name suggests, it works with concept checking questions. It provides you with them. And here is an example here of the concept questions that he uses in the book for that future perfect continuous. He explains, the core meaning and then gives 2 concept checking questions. But what he also does is he works with timelines. Now, I've removed the timeline here from the PowerPoint because actually what I want us to do is play around with timelines in the live session. So this is a bit of a taster for what we can look at when we get to meet live. So as I draw to an end of this Gallery Teachers Masterclass, I hope I've been able to clarify for you how to go about writing ICQs, CCQs, and some options for working with other ways of checking meaning. And we will move very quickly now into the Q&A session where we can look at timelines and see how they work. Can I just leave you with a short reading list? We've got here a web article on timelines. We've got Scrivener's book that's been so warmly recommended by my trainees, and then Graham Workman's book as well. Just to finish, may I just remind you that besides this session, there is a whole library of wonderful teacher webinars. looking at a whole range of different ways of working with the ELT classroom. This is the Gallery Teachers Workshop, Continuous Professional Development. The hyperlink is available here, https://galleryteachers.com/ELT-workshops. Wonderful resource. I hope you enjoy working with it. It's my belief that as language teachers who facilitate language learning and support our learners, that we should take active responsibility for ensuring that they understand what's happening at all stages of the lesson. In my view, even the most advanced learners inevitably are not going to understand what you want them to do. The one time you didn't have an ICQ, an instruction checking question. So for me, it is really important, because the one time we don't do it is sure to be the time when the students just get completely lost. And that's what we want to avoid. We need to use CCQs, as without them, we run the risk that the students tell us, if we ask the question, do you understand, that they have understood, but we have no active feedback mechanism for knowing that they generally have. So CCQs do two things. They probe understanding, helping the student to achieve clarity, but they also provide the student and us with knowledge that they have got it. Plus, if the student didn't catch the understanding of the grammar or the vocabulary you were teaching first time round, the CCQ is a fantastic second opportunity for them to be able to understand what it is you want them to be able to use. Yes, definitely. There are many other ways of checking students' understanding. The use of realia, the use of translation if appropriate, and very often it will be, the use of student explanation, and a whole host of others, including timelines, which we cover in the workshop.